The wind came down off the ridge like a living thing, cold and mean, carrying needles of sleet that found every gap in a man's collar. I'd been working timber camps for near 40 years, long enough to know that winter in the high country didn't care about your plans or your pride. It just waited, patient as stone, for you to make a mistake. This camp sat in a clearing hemmed by spruce and jack pine, about 2 miles from the main logging road. 12 of us bunked in 2 long canvas and plank shelters, the kind that leaked cold through every seam once the temperature dropped below freezing. The work was hard, felling, limbing, bucking logs into sections, and the days were short. By 4 in the afternoon, the light bled out of the sky, and we'd gather around the main fire pit to thaw our hands and cook whatever we'd hauled in. That fire pit was the heart of camp, a shallow depression ringed with stones someone had kicked together years ago. It did the job, barely. The flames whipped sideways in the wind, smoke chased you no matter where you stood, and sparks danced off into the dark like angry fireflies. More than once I'd watched embers land on dry pine needles 20 feet away, glowing there until someone stomped them out. The wood we burned was always damp, cut green or soaked from snow, and it hissed and smoked more than it burned. The other men didn't seem to mind. They were younger, most of them, with that restless energy that mistakes discomfort for toughness. They'd huddle close to the flames, cursing the cold, then retreat to the shelters to sleep in layers of wool and canvas. In the morning, they'd do it all again. I'd seen too many winters to waste energy on cursing. The cold didn't care. The wind didn't listen. What mattered was the system, how you set things up, how you thought 3 steps ahead. So on the 3rd night in camp, after the others had turned in, I walked a slow circle around the fire pit with a hand axe and a coil of rope, studying the ground by lamplight. The wind came from the northwest, almost always. The shelters sat to the east, maybe 30 yards off. Between them and the fire, there was nothing but open ground, which meant sparks had a clear run if the wind kicked up. The fire itself sat in a depression, but not deep enough to hold heat or block the gusts that scattered embers and made every flame a fight. I drove stakes into the frozen ground at 4 points, forming a rough rectangle around the pit, then paced off distances. 12 feet on the long sides, 8 feet on the short. Big enough to work in, small enough to hold warmth. I marked the spots with stones and went to bed, my breath clouding in the frigid air inside the shelter. The next morning, after the crew headed out with saws and axes, I stayed behind. My knees weren't what they used to be, and the foreman knew I was better used on camp tasks than hauling logs through snow. I told him I'd handle firewood and maintenance. He shrugged and left me to it. I started with stones. There were plenty in the area, glacial rubble, some as big as my head, scattered through the trees and along the old creek bed 50 yards south. I hauled them back in a canvas sling, 1 load at a time, my breath steaming in the sharp air. The temperature hovered just below freezing, and the ground crunched under my boots. I laid the first course on the northwest side, where the wind hit hardest. Flat stones on the bottom for stability, then smaller ones wedged into gaps. I worked without mortar, just gravity and friction, setting each stone so it leaned slightly inward. The wall grew slowly, 1 foot high, then 2. I left gaps near the base, slots about 6 inches wide, so air could still feed the fire. A fire needs to breathe, but it doesn't need to be beaten by every gust. By midday, I had the northwest wall waist high. My hands ached, the knuckles raw inside my gloves. I stopped to eat, cold biscuit and dried meat, and noticed the sky thickening to the west. More weather coming. I worked through the afternoon, building the side walls lower, about knee-high, to funnel wind over the pit instead of straight through it. The east side, nearest the shelters, I left open for now, just a low lip of stones to mark the boundary. I wanted access, but I also wanted a reflective surface to throw heat back. When the crew came in at dusk, they found me dragging a long, straight pine log toward the fire, still green and heavy with sap. I'd cut it from a standing dead snag, a twisted old thing that wouldn't be missed. I propped it across 2 stone supports on the east side, about 4 feet off the ground and angled slightly back. It would serve as the spine for a reflector wall, something to hold heat in and keep sparks from drifting toward the shelters. "Hell you building, old man?" That was Harlan, a broad-shouldered kid from downriver, all swagger and white teeth. He tossed his axe onto the woodpile and grinned at the others. "Looks like a damn fort." "Windbreak," I said, not looking up. I was lashing smaller logs horizontally across the uprights I'd sunk into the ground, building a framework. "We got a windbreak," Harlan said, jerking his thumb at the shelters. "It's called getting inside." A few of the others laughed. I kept working. "Suit yourself," Harlan said, shaking his head. "Just seems like a lot of effort for a fire that's going to burn the same either way." I didn't argue. Words don't teach like experience does. I finished the frame and started packing the gaps with chunks of moss and clay-heavy soil I'd scraped from the creek bank. It wouldn't be airtight, but it'd hold heat and block wind. I angled the whole thing back slightly, maybe 15 degrees, so it'd reflect warmth toward the center of the pit. That night, the wind picked up hard. The temperature dropped, and sleet rattled against the canvas shelters like thrown gravel. The men huddled around the fire pit, but the flames kept guttering and twisting, chased by gusts that came over the low stone walls. Smoke swirled everywhere, stinging eyes and throats. "Should have built it higher," someone muttered. I'd stacked a row of wet logs along the top edge of the northwest wall earlier, setting them on flat stones so air could pass beneath. Now, with the fire burning below, I could see steam rising from the bark. The heat was climbing the wall, radiating back into the pit, and the logs on top were drying. "What's with the logs up there?" asked Ben, one of the older hands, a man who didn't waste words. "Drying," I said. "Closer to the heat, but not close enough to catch. They'll be ready in a day or two." Ben studied the setup, then nodded slowly. He didn't laugh. That was something. Over the next 2 days, I kept building. I raised the northwest wall another foot, filling gaps with clay and smaller stones. I added a second row of drying logs, propped on a makeshift rack I'd lashed together from saplings. The rack sat inside the stone perimeter, near the fire but not over it, and it held maybe 30 pieces, enough for a night's burn if they dried properly. The reflector wall on the east side took shape too. I filled the frame with tight-packed earth and moss, then covered the whole thing with a layer of flat stones I'd split from a shale outcrop. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. When the fire burned, the wall threw heat back toward the center, and I could feel the difference standing 5 feet away. The crew noticed, but they didn't say much. They'd crack jokes. "Old man's building a castle. Gonna put a roof on it next?" But I caught them glancing at the setup when they thought I wasn't looking. They saw the logs drying on the rack, saw the way the fire burned hotter and steadier when the wind couldn't rip straight through. On the 4th night, the weather turned mean. A front pushed through just after sunset, dropping the temperature fast. The sleet turned to snow, wet and heavy, and the wind howled through the trees. Ice formed on my beard, and my fingers went numb inside my gloves, even when I held them near the flames. The fire pit was a different animal now. The stone walls blocked the worst of the wind, and the flames stood tall and steady, licking at the dry wood I'd been rotating through the drying rack. I fed the fire with logs that had spent 2 days near the heat, and they caught quick, burning clean with almost no smoke. The reflector wall threw warmth back across the pit, and for the first time since we'd made camp, I could stand comfortably without smoke in my face or sparks pelting my coat. The crew gathered close, stomping snow off their boots. Harlan crouched near the fire, holding his hands out, and I saw him glance at the wall, then at the drying rack. "Burns hotter," he said, not quite a question. "Drier wood," I said. "Burns hotter, burns longer, less smoke." "How long's it take to dry?" "Depends. 2 days close to the fire like this, sometimes less if it's small splits. Greenwood, you're looking at a week or more, and even then it'll hiss and spit." He poked at a log with a stick, watching steam curl off the bark of the pieces on the rack. Huh. The storm hit hardest around midnight. I woke to the sound of canvas snapping and the low roar of wind in the pines. Someone was shouting outside. Ben, I thought. I pulled on my boots and coat and stumbled out into the dark. The fire was still burning, a solid core of red coals and steady flame, but the wind was fiercer than I'd ever felt in this camp. It came in gusts that shook the trees and sent snow swirling in horizontal sheets. Sparks lifted from the fire, bright against the dark, but they hit the stone wall and fell back, or they rose and scattered over safe ground. None made it near the shelters. Ben stood near the pit, his face lit by the fire, watching the walls hold. Harlan was there too, and a couple of others, all of them staring at the setup like they were seeing it for the first time. Damn, Harlan said, his voice almost lost in the wind. Without that wall, this whole camp'd be one big spark hazard. I didn't say anything. I just fed another log onto the fire, a dry one from the rack, and watched it catch. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a foot of fresh snow and air so cold it hurt to breathe. The fire had burned all night, tended in shifts, and the pit was still warm. The stones radiated heat, the reflector wall held steady, and the drying rack was full of logs that'd be ready by nightfall. The crew gathered for breakfast, and I noticed them looking at the walls, running their hands over the stones, checking the gaps for airflow. Ben crouched by the rack, lifting a log to test its weight. Lighter, he said. A lot lighter. Less water, I said. More heat per log. You can carry more and it burns better. How'd you know to build it like this? Harlan asked. He wasn't grinning now. He was serious, curious. Didn't know, I said. Just figured. Wind's the enemy in a camp like this. It scatters heat, spreads sparks, makes everything harder. So you block it where you can, and you use what heat you've got to solve other problems, like drying wood. Could we build one at the other shelter? Ben asked. I shrugged. Could. Take a few days and you'd need to plan it. Wind direction, distance from the shelter, stone supply. But yeah, it'd work. Over the next week, the camp changed. The crew started hauling stones, asking questions about height and airflow and spacing. I walked them through the basics, how to set a foundation, how to leave gaps for draft, how to angle a reflector wall. They built a second fire pit near the far shelter, smaller than mine but solid, and they rigged up their own drying racks with green poles and scrap rope. The wood supply improved fast. Instead of burning half-wet logs that smoked and sputtered, we had a rotation of dry fuel ready every evening. The fires burned hotter and cleaner, the camp stayed warmer, and we used less wood overall because it burned more efficiently. No one complained about smoke anymore, and no one worried about sparks when the wind kicked up. Harlan stopped calling it a fort. He called it a system. One night, maybe 10 days after the big storm, we sat around my fire pit after supper. The flames crackled steady, the heat bouncing off the reflector wall, and the air smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. The sky was clear, stars sharp as broken glass, and the temperature had dropped low enough that breath froze in the air. You ever think about writing this down? Ben asked. He was working a piece of harness leather with a knife, patching a strap. The wall, the rack, the whole setup. Somebody ought to know. It's not new, I said. People have been building fire pits and reflectors for as long as there have been fires. I just paid attention. Yeah, but most folks don't, Harlan said. He was leaning back against the stone wall, his coat open despite the cold. They just do what they've always done, even if it don't work so good. That's the trick, I said. Doing what works, not what's easy. We sat quiet for a while, the fire popping softly, the wind a low whisper in the trees. Someone passed around a flask, and I took a short pull, cheap whiskey that burned all the way down, and handed it back. Next camp, Ben said. I'm building one of these first thing. Me too, Harlan said. I nodded, staring into the flames. That was enough. The winter dragged on, as winters do. We cut timber, hauled logs, patched gear, and burned through cords of firewood. The cold never let up, but the camp stayed livable. The fire pits kept us warm, the drying racks kept us in good fuel, and the stone walls kept us safe. When new men rotated into camp, they saw the setup and asked questions, and the crew taught them, passing along the knowledge the way it's supposed to be passed, hand to hand, fire to fire. I stayed through the end of the season until the snow started to soften and the days stretched long enough that you could feel spring in the air. On my last night, the crew threw together a rough supper, beans and bacon, bread baked in a skillet, and we ate around the fire pit, the stones still warm from the day's burn. "Gonna miss this," Harlan said, patting the wall like it was a good horse. "Build another one next winter," I said. "Plan to," he said. "Gonna build a better one." I smiled at that. Better was always possible. When I left the next morning, heading down the logging road with my pack and my axe, I turned back once to look at the camp. The fire pit sat quiet, the racks empty, the stone walls dark against the snow. They'd stand there through the thaw and into the next season, ready for the next crew, the next winter, the next fire. That was the thing about good work. It lasted. Now I've been thinking a lot about that camp, about the lessons that came from a simple idea and some hard work. Winter teaches you things if you're willing to listen. It teaches you that preparation matters, that small improvements add up, and that the old ways aren't always the best ways, but the principles behind them usually are. Block the wind, use your heat, dry your fuel, keep your people safe. Those lessons don't just apply to fire pits. They apply to everything you do in the backcountry, from building a shelter to purifying water to staying alive when the temperature drops and the storms roll in. The wilderness doesn't care about your plans, but it rewards the people who think ahead, who pay attention, who take the time to build things right. I've spent a lifetime learning these lessons the hard way. Cold nights, close calls, mistakes that could have been disasters. And I've spent just as long watching people make the same mistakes I did, because nobody ever showed them a better way. That's why I wanted to share this story with you. Not because I think I've got all the answers, but because I know these principles work, and I know they can keep you alive when it matters most. If you're out there learning wilderness skills, practicing survival techniques, or just trying to understand how to live more competently in rough country, you're on the right path. It's not about being the toughest or the most extreme. It's about being smart, methodical, and willing to learn from the people who've gone before you. I'll keep sharing what I've learned, stories from the field, practical techniques, honest lessons from a lifetime in the woods. If that's something you want more of, if you're serious about building your skills and understanding how things really work out there, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Join this community of people who care about doing things right, who value knowledge over shortcuts, and who understand that survival is a craft you build one skill at a time. There's a lot more I want to teach you. How to read weather, how to find water in frozen country, how to make a fire when everything's wet, how to keep your gear working when the temperature drops below zero. These aren't just stories, they're tools, and tools are only useful if you have them when you need them. So subscribe, be part of this, learn with us. And the next time you're out there in the cold, building your fire, stacking your wood, you'll have the knowledge you need to do it right. You'll be the one the others look to when the wind picks up and the temperature drops. You'll be the one who knows. I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there. The old Woodsman story reminds me of something my own grandfather used to say, long before I ever set foot in a logging camp or spent a winter under canvas. He'd say, "Son, the difference between a good woodsman and a dead one isn't strength. It's attention." He meant paying attention to the little things, the direction of the wind, the weight of a cloud, the way snow sits on a branch. Those little things add up to big differences when the stakes are high. I didn't understand that when I was younger. I thought survival was about toughness, about pushing through, about ignoring discomfort and pain. I learned the hard way that it's not. It's about systems. It's about efficiency. It's about setting things up so the environment works with you instead of against you. That fire pit wall wasn't just a windbreak. It was a force multiplier. It turned a marginal fire into a good one. It turned wet wood into dry wood. It turned a dangerous camp into a safe one. And it did all that with nothing but stones, logs, and a little bit of planning. The skepticism from the other loggers didn't surprise me. People resist new ideas, especially when the old ways seem good enough. But good enough isn't the same as good. Good enough gets you through the night. Good gets you through the winter. And when you're 2 miles from help and the temperature's dropping, good is what you need. I remember the first time I built a reflector wall myself, years before that logging camp. I was trapping in the Northern Territories, running a line through country so remote I wouldn't see another human for weeks at a time. I had a main camp, a rough cabin, really, more of a shack. But I also had spike camps scattered along the trap line, places where I could hole up for a night or two without backtracking. At one of those spike camps, I got stuck by weather. A storm rolled in, the kind that turns the world white and makes you forget there was ever such a thing as warmth. I had a fire going in a shallow pit, but the wind was relentless, and I was burning through my woodpile faster than I could keep it stocked. I knew if I didn't solve the problem, I'd either freeze or exhaust myself cutting fuel. So I built a wall. Not as elaborate as the one in the logging camp, but the same principle. I stacked deadfall logs in a rough crescent on the windward side, packed snow in the gaps, and angled a couple of flat stones to reflect heat back. It took maybe an hour, working with numb fingers and a constant stream of curses. But it worked. The fire settled, the wind broke, and I felt the difference immediately. I didn't have to feed the flames as often. The heat stayed where I needed it. I slept that night in relative comfort, and when I woke, I had enough dry wood stacked near the fire to last another day if I needed it. That's when I started thinking about fire pits differently, not just as a place to burn wood, but as a tool you could refine and improve. Over the years, I experimented with different designs, full enclosures for high-wind areas, open pits for calm nights, reflector walls angled at different degrees. I learned what worked and what didn't, and I learned that the best setups were always the ones tailored to the specific conditions. In that logging camp, I had the luxury of time and materials. I could build something solid, something that would last the season. But the principles scaled. You could apply the same ideas with less, a couple of rocks and a chunk of dead wood, arranged to block wind and reflect heat. The sophistication of the build mattered less than the thinking behind it. That's what I tried to teach the younger men in that camp, though I'm not sure I ever said it out loud. The wall wasn't the lesson. The lesson was paying attention, thinking ahead, and not settling for good enough when good was within reach. Harlan got it eventually. He was a smart kid under all that bluster, and once he saw the results, he started asking the right questions. Not, why'd you build it like that? But, how'd you figure out the spacing? And, what would happen if we moved the rack closer? Those were the questions of someone who wanted to understand, not just copy. Ben got it too, though he'd probably understood from the start. He was old enough to have made his own mistakes, and old enough to recognize a good idea when he saw one. He didn't need convincing. He just needed to see it work. The others came around slower, but they came around. By the end of the season, every man in that camp knew how to build a proper fire pit. They knew how to read the wind, how to space stones for airflow, how to rig a drying rack, how to angle a reflector. They'd take that knowledge with them to the next camp, the next job, and they'd teach it to the next group of greenhorns who showed up thinking they knew everything. That's how it's supposed to work. Knowledge doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to everyone who's willing to learn it and pass it on. And the wilderness, cold, indifferent, beautiful, rewards the people who share what they've learned, because it means fewer mistakes, fewer close calls, fewer tragedies. I've seen men die in the woods. Not many, but enough. Hypothermia, mostly, or accidents that could have been prevented with a little more knowledge or a little more care. I've also seen men thrive in conditions that should have killed them, because they knew what they were doing, and they'd prepared for the worst. The difference between those outcomes is never dramatic. It's not a moment of heroism or a stroke of genius. It's 100 small decisions, made over days or weeks, that add up to survival or disaster. It's choosing to build a windbreak instead of just huddling closer to the fire. It's taking the time to dry your wood instead of burning it wet. It's checking the distance between your fire and your shelter, and double-checking it when the wind shifts. Those decisions seem boring when you're making them. They don't feel like life or death. But they are. I think about that sometimes when I'm teaching, or when I'm sharing stories like this one. I wonder if people understand how high the stakes really are. The wilderness isn't a theme park. It's not a controlled environment where someone's going to bail you out if you screw up. It's real, and it's dangerous, and it will kill you if you let it. But it's also fair. It doesn't care who you are or where you come from. It doesn't care if you're strong or weak, young or old, experienced or green. It only cares about what you do. And if you do the right things, if you pay attention and prepare and build your skills one at a time, it will let you live. That's the deal. That's always been the deal. In that logging camp, the deal played out over the course of a winter. The men who learned, who adapted, who built their fire pits right, they stayed warm, they stayed safe, and they went home when the season ended. The ones who didn't learn would have struggled, but they got lucky. They had people around them who knew better, and they had time to figure it out before the stakes got too high. Not everyone gets that luck. Not everyone has a mentor or a crew or a margin for error. That's why I'm here, talking to you, sharing these stories. Because maybe you're the person who needs to hear this. Maybe you're planning a trip into rough country, or maybe you're just curious about how things work when the temperature drops and the wind howls. Either way, the knowledge is here if you want it. And if you do want it, if you're serious about learning, about building real skills that could save your life someday, then I need you to take one more step. Subscribe to this channel. Don't just watch and move on. Commit to learning. Join a community of people who care about competence, who value preparation, and who understand that survival is a craft you build over time. I've got more to teach. I've got stories from the trapline, from the mountains, from rivers and deserts and frozen lakes. I've got techniques for fire making, shelter building, navigation, and a dozen other skills that separate the people who make it from the people who don't. But I can only share that with you if you're here to receive it. So, subscribe. Right now, make that commitment. And the next time you're out there, whether it's a weekend camping trip or a serious backcountry expedition, you'll have the tools you need. You'll know how to read the wind. You'll know how to build a fire that works. You'll know how to stay safe when the weather turns and the night closes in. That's the promise I'm making. Practical knowledge, real skills, honest lessons from a lifetime in the field. No gimmicks, no fluff. Just the truth about what works and what doesn't. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and winter's always coming. Stay sharp, stay safe, and remember, the wilderness doesn't care. But you can learn to work with it instead of against it, and that makes all the difference.